I'd like to take a little time to welcome everyone to the City of Decatur's Anti-Racism Speaker Series. This is the second in a series of conversations that we're having this fall where we strive to work to become a more anti-racist city. And in the second year, we have been inviting scholars, authors, activists, folks who work in various parts of our communities to join us as we cultivate strategies for doing better by figuring out how we can be better together. This series is hosted by the Better Together Advisory Board in partnership with the Decatur City Commission. At the heart of this series really is a belief that our lives are enriched and enlivened when we dwell in spaces where we can appreciate and learn from the unique experiences of others. And while it has been a distinct honor and pleasure to facilitate the various other events that we've had this year and last year, I am particularly excited about this evening's conversation. This is a conversation with my neighbors. This is a conversation with people who are just as invested in the future of Decatur as I am. And I truly believe that this is the type of conversation that can immediately make a difference. You know, I spend most of my time thinking about how do we create hospitable, trusting, and inclusive spaces where folks are willing to engage about and across their differences in order to improve our shared communities. And as I was preparing and thinking about tonight's conversations and the flow of it, the type of questions I'm interested in asking my colleagues this evening, I was reminded by Lisa Kempinski and Tina Nielsen's book that's entitled Inclusion Nudges. And it's an outstanding book that provides over 100 recommendations for designing encounters that can reduce bias while simultaneously making inclusion an organizational default. And one of the things that they wrote, I would like to share with you. And they wrote, making sure people are included, have a voice, feel listened to, and feel their insights and perspectives matter are not only important, it is crucial to our communities, cities, workplaces, organizations, and society. We are beyond inclusion being nice to have, an option. Inclusion is a global necessity, a must. It must be default and norm in any kind of development, policymaking, and decision. It seems to me that trust has to be part of the foundational piece for a societal shift in thinking about inclusion from nice to have to a default and norm. One of the ways that I think about trust is that it's that belief that our differences and our vulnerabilities will not be held against us. And I'm truly thankful that the 5 people who are joining me this evening for this conversation trust that my intentions are grounded in a desire to honor their unique perspectives and to leverage their wisdom to cultivate a more inclusive and better Decatur. I am humbled that they trust that I will work to make this a space where they have a voice, they feel listened to, and their unique perspectives are accounted for. I also want to thank you in the audience for being here. We're also honored that you have decided to digitally hang out with us this evening. And there are a couple of logistical announcements that I'd like to make before shifting to introduce the other people journeying with me this evening. One, while I'm very much honored to have this conversation, and I will ask questions. We hope that you will submit questions through the Q&A boxes at the bottom of your screen if you're on a laptop, or at the top of your screen if you're on a mobile phone. Two, we turned off the feature that allows for us to capture your images. The only images that you will see are the six of us. And finally, you will receive a short, about 2-minute anonymous survey after the program that will inform our future events. And now I want to take a little time to briefly introduce my conversation partners. They will also introduce themselves as well through one of the questions that I have. Kayla Evans, a Decatur High School student, serves as the co-president for the Student Coalition for Equity, and is the founder and organizer in Decatur High School Students Talk About Race, STAR. Fonta High is the co-chair of the Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights. She is also a licensed professional counselor for over 12 years and an addiction counselor specializing in trauma treatment. Maggie Fehrman. Dr. Fehrman is the superintendent of the City Schools of Decatur. She has also served as the City Schools of Decatur Executive Director of Schools and its assistant superintendent. Jennifer Ross. Captain Ross is with the City of Decatur Police Department. Captain Ross has served as its communications officer, a patrol officer, a business district officer, a child safety advocate, an investigator, and a supervisor of the criminal investigations division. If it's her job in the city, in the police department, it sounds like Captain Ross has done it. Koan Roy-Meighoo is a student leader for the Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights, is a founding member of the City Schools of Decatur's Student Coalition for Equity. Koan is a first-year undergraduate student at Emory University and an alumnus of Decatur High School. And so, my first question for you, that I'm curious, how do you spend your time and energy working to improve Decatur? How do you do that, and why do you choose that as the mechanism that you use to try to improve the city that we are hanging out in? Whoever would like to start.
I can go.
Thank you.
So I really value like working with people who are like-minded and who share like the same values as me and the same goals, and kind of working with people like that and building like a relationship and working towards the same goal is like always rewarding just by itself. And I feel like making an impact, whether it be like big or small, is also like super fulfilling, even if I don't see the immediate like benefit. So that's why I work in my community.
Nice. Thank you, Kayla.
I guess I'll go next, Ed. The way I do that, it's in my work with Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights and creating a space where we organize for people of African descent to address issues of inequity wherever they exist, whether it's in criminal justice, in the school system, or otherwise. And in that work, we're doing work of empowerment. And they have individuals who are experiencing those inequities, have an organization behind them to support them as they work to make change.
Hey, Ed, and I'll share. Part of the reason I looked at City Schools of Decatur as a place to work several years ago was the commitment to equity. I'm a strong believer in the equity work and loved the equity plan that I saw outlined for City Schools of Decatur and its strong commitment to that. And it's what drew me. I was looking around saying, hey, let's, I was ready for a change in my career and really wanted to find a place that spoke to my passions. And City Schools of Decatur was a clear choice for me to make that decision. And, doing that work every day fills my bucket, and really helping others around me in the community feel that they can also make those changes, even if there's small little changes each day, is what keeps me going.
Hi, Ed. I grew up not too terribly far from Decatur. I graduated from Clarkston High School, so I was super familiar with Decatur, coming to football games, coming through the city. And I treasured my experience at Clarkston High School. And when I started looking for jobs in policing when I was leaving college, Decatur was on kind of my drilled down list. And I was picky in particular about what agency I was going to apply with. And I'm glad I ended up where I did, because I love problem solving. I love being able to help people. I love being able to have the time in a small community with a small agency to try to get at the root of problems and not just answer calls and move on. And it's just another person that you're walking past. I've actually been able to develop long-term relationships with a lot of the people that I've come to know in the city through being a police officer, that officers in very large agencies don't have that option. It's not something that they have available to them.
Yeah, I think having grown up in Decatur and living here since 4th grade, I feel kind of obliged to be active in the Decatur community. There's a sense of, having been educated in this system, I understand the great things about City Schools of Decatur's, and I also understand, what needs some work. And so, be it through the Beacon Hill Black Alliance or the Student Coalition for Equity or the newly launched Decatur Justice Coalition, my work really centers on education, be it in the community or in our schools, making sure that we are telling everybody's stories, like you said, making sure that inclusion is necessary and not just a choice.
So one of the things in listening to you that is a commonality is a zeal for problem solving, that whether it's Kayla's looking for like minds, or Maggie being driven by a sense of equity, that's the attraction. There's a challenge and need to figure out how to solve that problem and address it. I'm curious if we can drill down into one thing that you are working on, that there's an issue that you are working on to improve the city of Decatur. And what's an issue where you have to work with other people, collaborate with them, build a sense of collection, where you get others to participate in order to be successful? Where are places where we need help? You need help from others in order to achieve your goal. Jennifer.
Yes, I don't want to jump in, but I wanted to raise my hand. This is a topic that is close to my heart, something I've worked, around and with for years. But for us right now, what I am working on very hard at the police department, and I'm not the only one, is meaningful response to calls for service and addressing issues around mental health services and homelessness, where mental health and or homelessness are a factor. As we have had a growing homeless population in our downtown area since Peachtree and Pine closed down back in 2017. And with that came a push from, certain community members that are questioning why this is allowed to be happening, which is a hard question to answer. And then other community members, what are you doing to help? And other community members, why are you making contact and speaking to people, when a lot of what we've been doing has been relationship building so that we can try to provide resources or connect with resources. And this has required, we're police officers, we're trained police officers. We have a certain amount of mental health training and our ongoing training, but we are not clinicians. And sometimes the very fact that we're police officers puts up a barrier. So partnerships, collaboration it's a must. It's a must. And those partnerships have included everything from us and NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, a partnership with Frontline, which used to be the Atlanta Dream Center. And that is the organizations that is partnered with the city overall to provide assistance related to homelessness and placement for addiction issues, but not as much geared toward mental health services. We have been researching for a period of time the best way to staff and partner with, perhaps staff a person with the city or partner with a mental health, having a mental health professional available to us. And what we have decided is kind of our best path is to not share, not just partner with an organization to provide us with one or two clinicians twice a week or a few times a month, but is to actually have a dedicated mental health clinician working for the city through a partnership with DeKalb County Community Service Board and the Crisis Center, the DeKalb Crisis Center, so that we can have not only a clinician that will respond to calls with officers when needed, but also do follow-up on calls, do outreach on locations or people or situations where the officers, and not just officers, but the fire department, active living, there's sometimes things are brought to our attention that are not just through officer contact. And to have that person also there for the outreach and for staff training, ongoing staff training for the police department. But we've also collaborated with other city departments, active living being a big one, and then also churches and other service organizations. And something that I've learned to do in the last probably 2 years is not wait for cases that do end up in the criminal justice system to somehow later get funneled into mental health court referrals, but to make the mental health court referrals immediately upon arrest. So when that's coming from the department that actually made the arrest and you're able to provide more information and background, that's very different from someone sitting in the jail or sitting and waiting on their case, which could be in DeKalb County pre-COVID, 6 months, 9 months, a year, and going ahead and getting them referred into mental health court. So that's been a help.
Fonta, you look like you wanted to say something.
Oh, did I? Okay.
Maybe not.
No, you're right. You read me right. One of those ways that I'm doing that is through my Decolonize Decatur committee work, and that looks like deconstruction and construction. So the deconstruction is providing community education around physical symbols of white supremacy and helping community members understand when they came to be, how they came to be, what's at the root of that, and then organizing community members to remove them, or if appropriate, it would be contextualization. And then the second piece of that in terms of what we're constructing is through the art platform, Art for the People. And both of those committees in Decolonize Decatur involves multiple sectors of the community, whether it's student organizers like Koan and others, or whether it's clergy, or whether it's friends from Decatur makers who are part of Art for the People, and other community organizers who are part of other groups, then they may comprise Art for the People or Decolonize Decatur Committee. And so with the Art for the People work, it's about talking about those issues of inequity and using that as a political platform to create change through art, which we believe art is education and art is healing. And so that just opens up many avenues to engage community, which also includes the Art for the People curriculum. And so that means we're also reaching to the academy. So we have relationships we've built with Emory and with Georgia State University and Agnes Scott College, for example. And so they're a part of that work as well with Decolonize Decatur.
And I'll share, I think as a school system, we try to engage and collaborate with partners in the community all the time. And that's a really important way for us to make sure we achieve our goals. And there's, through COVID, partnerships with the Department of Health. We're working on some plans for launching an enhanced early learning program so that more students can get affordable childcare within the city school system, to even looking at how do we advance and provide growth opportunities for current staff members. So we may partner with a university like Kennesaw State University, and how do we build a program with that partnership to give classified staff an opportunity to enhance their education. We know that they're sometimes not the highest paid members of our staff. So how do we support them through that and give them some stipends to help pay for that, to help pay for those programs? I think the Early Learning Center and the work that we have planned for that is a huge collaboration between Department the Decatur Housing Authority, DEF. There's so many ways to engage and collaborate with the community around us. That's another reason I really, really enjoy working in this city, is that it's just such an open space for people to jump in and put all hands together to get the job done.
Kayla and Koan, I have a question along these lines for you, but one of the things I'm interested in, both of you are founding members of organizations at your school to deal with questions of inclusion and equity. And I'm curious, what were some of the maybe impediments or challenges that you had to deal with in recruiting, building coalitions, if you will, developing collaborative relationships, getting the support that you needed, along those particular lines?
I can say that, talk about that a little bit. I think specifically thinking about my education reform initiatives, it's really important to me and the Student Coalition for Equity in general, just kind of like to make sure that all of our efforts are kind of this grassroots form of activism, which means we are constantly bringing in different groups, different social spheres, different, institutions into our work. And so what that means is, student involvement is actually pretty easy to get, because a lot of students are pretty upset right now, with a lot of things happening in our country at the national stage down to our, school system itself. There's a drive for students to change, and they're just looking for opportunities to do so. And so what it becomes is searching for all of the institutions who are willing to help students, who are willing to platform students at that. So, speaking to academics across the nation to get their insight about what just curriculum looks like, speaking to the superintendent and people in central office to talk about the logistics of like implementing a curriculum reform initiative, talking to outside organizations about including different voices. Who do we need to represent? Who's not being represented right now? It's about bringing in all those different spheres, and kind of the challenge can be kind of navigating between all these, because they're not built to be in communication with each other structurally, and historically. And so as students, kind of what we're trying to do is bridge that gap through kind of just that drive for change and that, raw experience.
And I think also with that, having different modes of like communication is important, especially for students, because, not all students are comfortable, directly speaking out. So I think like having, even like we had a forum, when people could present themselves. We also had an option to where someone could present, their issue on their behalf. So it was kind of more anonymous. And for people like who aren't as outspoken as others, that's more comfortable for them. But it still gets, the point across. And so I think keeping in mind people's different comfortable, how comfortable they are in different like atmospheres is important, because they still need to be represented and heard as well.
And add, of course, that also the point that Kayla's making about students not being always fully comfortable speaking out. That extends to adults as well. Because if we're telling the truth, individuals, people of color, Black residents in City of Decatur and the various structures in which they're operating in have experienced retaliation, are still concerned about retaliation if they do buck against the system. And so with that being present, an organization like Beacon Hill becomes a bit of a safety net for them, because we're speaking as an organization about these issues versus one lone person stepping out. Even though other Black residents may know what that person's saying is true, there's so much they stand to lose, whether it's their job or something educationally happens or otherwise.
Kayla and Fonta, the direction that the conversation is heading has got me thinking about, there are just numerous surveys that have been done over the last few years about waning trust that we have of institutions. Many of these are national, like how much trust do we have in Congress? How much trust do we have in the executive branch? But just in institutions in general, educational systems, policing departments, and even ourselves as individuals, as citizens, do we trust each other? And I'm curious that in the various things that we have talked about, whether it's Jennifer talking about mental health, or decolonizing our public spaces that was mentioned, or even building equity programs in our schools that Maggie, Kayla, and Koan spoke to, it requires some engagement with institutions that some people feel are rigged against them, and that they have concerns about bucking up against those systems because there are both local and national histories at play that indicate that that doesn't go well. So I'm curious, what are things that both have been done in order to generate a sense of trust, however you're thinking about that, what you have seen as being successful, or what are things that you think can be done in order to build that foundation for that collaboration that we need to achieve the goals for those projects that you spoke about?
I'll go ahead and jump in, and I think generating a sense of trust is important. And I agree, there is a waning sense of trust. And I'll even, call out my own school system, that there is a sense that how the school system runs and how things are set up is not equitable for all parties involved. Ran through an activity this morning with district and school leaders about our grading process and how grades are assigned and how does a student get a grade. And we talked about the power, who has the power of the knowledge of the grade, and in zero instances does it rest with the student. So the conversation is, if the student has no power with the grade, what needs to happen to change that? And that transparency and giving the students the power to understand their grade, to change their grade, to make the differences so they know what they can do to help improve that grade and grow. I think that talking about power when it comes to distrust is who has the power, who's holding the power, and how do we create more equitable power throughout so everyone has that knowledge and ability to be successful. To me, that's one of the key pieces of how do we reform a school system, is dismantling power structures where it rests solely with individual people that have been in places of authority. And I'll say one of the things I really enjoy about working for a board of 5 members that are very diverse is they hold me accountable and they ask me tough questions. And to make sure that I'm not just doing this without considering all the implications and all the things that may happen, get some tough questions. And that's part of my job, is to be ready to say, here is the decision that was made, here's what we're doing. But I've asked people, I've gotten the input. We are holding up this frame and lens of equity as the way we are doing things going forward, and continuing with that transparency to me is key.
I want to pause there for a second, and then we'll continue. But I'm interested in dwelling here a little bit, but for others to jump in. I had this conversation a few days ago with this brilliant person, and they asked me the question, Ed, do you believe that systems want to share power? Do you believe that people want to actually engage in the act of power sharing? And what I'm hearing is that from you, Maggie, is yes, you're working towards, as you put it, dismantling power structures. You mentioned students. I'm curious, what does that look like?
Yeah.
In brass tacks policies, what are we talking about in those particular terms?
Several things for me. It's about initiating change, not from top down, but using better structures to get and elevate the voices of the historically marginalized individuals, and being conscientious about, as a white woman, how my power is appreciated by others around me, so that I can say, look, yes, I'm a white woman. I know I have some privilege in how I appear and what I have been brought up with. And not using that as, hey, I'm just going to go forward and do this because I'm in my position, but understanding that my position is there to help advocate for others around me. It's not just for me to be the superintendent. I'm very much a leader who wants to engage with stakeholders, elevate those voices of the marginalized, so that our system is producing what we want, which is equitable outcomes for our students. And we see if that doesn't happen, it's generational. So if we don't stop it now, it's going to be a long-term impact that's going to keep perpetuating through our society. So I really take my job very seriously about, how do I start engaging the students that have been marginalized, so that they have that chance to stand to get the equitable outcomes that our other students have been achieving for so long.
I'll answer that, Ed. A bit abstract and also very concrete. One of the ways that needs to look like is people who are in positions of power and authority taking risk, like taking real risk. Anytime somebody's a part of the oppressed or marginalized group and they're standing out to speak against the injustice that they've experienced, they take a risk. So we need to see those who have power or in these positions of authority also taking risk, bigger risk, right? And there needs to be some exposure in that way. Also, very concretely, what that needs to look like is as many people who are in positions that are just as important, that are just everyday positions, such as cleaning staff, as many of the cleaning staff being present, there needs to be as many people of color being present in positions of leadership. So for example, if you have, we're talking about the school system that has largely a kitchen and cleaning staff that is of color, we should see assistant principals and principals largely as many of those individuals as people of color example as well. And same thing in City of Decatur government. We need to see a lot of people of color in positions of leadership, if that's historically, that's been the group that's been marginalized in the city.
I think of the question of institutions sharing power and kind of how we can really catalyze that. It's obvious to say communication, but I think specifically thinking about how we communicate is really important. It's no surprise that Decatur is becoming more and more stratified and divided, I think. As we host equitable conversations, as we try to bridge gaps, there are also larger forces which are separating us. In my school, I've experienced this. In the community, gentrification is causing this. And so, we need to be not just having conversations on kind of a larger level like this, but everyday interaction with a more diverse community. And our schools can really change the environment of students and the mindset of students by putting students in conversation with a more diverse group of people. But just thinking about how we communicate on a day-to-day basis to kind of build that empathy, which does not exist right now, which is why there's not trust right now.
Yeah, going based off of what Koan was saying about empathy, I feel like a lot of people would it's so hard to kind of break through this gap, is that because people lack empathy, that they're more concerned about defending themselves rather than trying to understand or make progress. And I feel like being defensive it doesn't lead to anything good, because at that point you may be listening, but you're not trying to understand and actually process. You're more so thinking about, okay, what am I going to say next to defend myself? So really just having empathy, and not even trying to understand it, because some things it's like you can't understand it, but that's not the goal. It's more so to respect the person, especially if you're not in the position to completely understand them, and just like, you know, give them respect, and just basically take their word for it, and not try to like be necessarily in their shoes if you're unable to.
Yeah, Kayla, I think one of the things you just said is that what you started there is just really brilliant, of this notion of how do we situate ourselves and show up. And one of the ways that I think about that, and you're speaking to this, is that far too often, I think that most of our conversations center around our intent and not about our impact. And intent is very much about a self-centered response of what my objectives are and how the world reads me. Impact is very much other oriented, that it doesn't matter what my purpose and goals were, what I intended. What matters is how it landed and impacted the particular person. And if we could spend more time thinking about that and trying to orient our responses and how we engage around how we are impacting other people, then I think that we can move some of these conversations in a far more empathetic way, as both you and Koan are suggesting. Uh, I I I don't know if there's a place you want to jump in here, Jennifer.
I was thinking a lot about education, and even though I'm in law enforcement, I still think that education is a key to that. And that's, I think historically we've done a really bad job in law enforcement, and it's one of the reasons I got into it. I had some encounters, some experiences where I said, you know what, I can do this better, and I set out to do so. I think we've done a bad job of educating the public and also the officers that are working about, for the public. There's a lot. I remember a time when decisions were made, cases were made, there was, you know, arrests were made, and then there was no room for discussion. There was no room for, I remember this is a very young rookie officer where somebody's adult child is being arrested and there's a mother standing there screaming and asking questions, and you just get in the car and you drive off. And why? You know, and I know at some agencies it's the conflict. It's, you know, I know that I'm in the right and I'm following policy and I'm following law. Well, that's great and all, except for you just left someone standing on the side of the road screaming about their child, and it's completely unnecessary to leave them there with no questions answered. And I have been fortunate to work in a city that's small enough and not so big and busy that we've had the opportunity to have those conversations, or when it involves somebody's child and they have conversations. It's the difference between going like for process. This is the process. We fill out this form and we do this and we do this, but we don't have any conversation about it. And then, so there's no education there. And historically, there was not a good job being done with educating the officers on why that was important and what empathy is, and why it's important to even have that. What if this was your child? What if this was your mother? What if this was your brother or sister? You know, and that became a focal point in the last, 15, 16 years after Chief Booker took over as chief, was having empathy. We still have a job to do at the end of the day. That's not a pleasant job, because people don't call us because they're having a good day. They call us because something bad has happened or something's out of control. But that does not mean that you have to treat people in a way that you have to leave them, you have to disrespect them or leave them without their questions answered, because that's not helping anyone. It's not helping the family or the people that are involved, and it's not helping our department. So open conversations and having room for questions is and I think is a huge piece. So thinking about Dr. Fehrman talking about education and hearing the students talk about that goes far beyond school system, I think, because I think that ends up being a problem in more ways than just the schools.
want to weave part of this conversation into the police department. And of course, Captain Ross, interested in your thoughts, but this is an open conversation. That we started part of this conversation about trust, talking about the educational system and dismantling power structures and power sharing as a mode of engagement. I'm curious, does that language make sense? Does that conceptually make sense in terms of the way in which we think about police work in this country, in the city of Decatur? What does power sharing look like in terms of police work?
I think a big thing is kind of eliminating the double standard, because a lot of the times we see like consequences for the people who are like convicted, but like let's say an officer messes up or does something awful, you know, a lot of the times they're not held accountable.
And in terms of that accountability, it also looks like the system being so different that even their brothers or sisters in blue can feel, because of the culture shift, comfortable enough holding their brother or sister in blue accountable to say what needs to be said out loud without, again, fear of retaliation. And then enough of a culture shift too, that there's a different way to approach what's happening in the community, if at all possible, or maybe there doesn't even have to be an arrest that's made. Does that have to be the response? I understand that sometimes that may need to be the response, but does it have to be the response? Is there some additional education that can be given for how they can handle the situation?
I was waiting to see if anybody else wanted to jump in, because I can speak from a policing standpoint. You know, when you started talking about power sharing as far as it relates to the police department, I think back to being in college and studying criminal justice and the history of policing, and how something that didn't mean anything to me then, that means a lot to me now, 25 years into this career, had to do with talking about you can only police people up to a point that they're going to comply with it. And what that means is there is a lot more community members than there are police, and what is acceptable and okay versus illegal in one decade may not be that way now. And if you just look at how marijuana possession and use has been treated and changed over time, that's just a very simplistic example of that. The accountability piece is huge, because a lot of that has not been done in the way that it should have been done. And I always say it now, we're paying for the sins of the past, is what's happening now in policing. And there was very much well, we've got this, we're your police department and we'll handle this, and we don't need to talk about it or share it. And it's, you know, I'm going to hold my cards here. And that doesn't do your department, your officers, or your community any favors, when, if you think about why you're here, is to serve the community. And I think there's been decades of the police department's over here, and this is the community that we serve when we're over here. The officers come from the community. We don't build them and grow them. And the community is the people that are calling that need our help. So that can't be that way. And even when accountability was taking place and officers doing wrong were being held accountable, if that information is kind of hidden or not talked about, then that ends up being a problem too. And something I wanted to speak to, what Fonta said, that is arrest the answer. That is just such a huge structural issue in the criminal justice system. One of the most common misconceptions I get, and I think it's one of our biggest problems, is you have a situation where mental health, addiction, I'll just use those as because they're kind of top of the pile examples. whatever it is that you're dealing with, that is a crime. It is a crime. We have a crime, and you believe that mental health issues or addiction issues are behind it, but arresting that person and putting them in jail is not helping get to the root of that problem. It's now we're burning money housing someone, but we're not burning money treating that person. And so the push to get away from arrest always being that being the go-to, because honestly, that's all we've had. And I've had I've had it very recently, had to have conversations about, well, why can't you put this person in treatment? Or why can't you take this person somewhere? Or why can't you make this? I would love to, but I can't sentence someone to a treatment program, and I can't mandate someone go to a mental health facility. The mechanism as a police officer that I have at my disposal to put a person in front of a judge, who is the person that can mandate treatment and maybe going to a center, is arrest. And that's the problem. So an example would be us trying, and we had this recently where we had someone breaking the law, and we called, it was clearly a mental health issue. We opted to go with a medical mental health because we had what we needed to do. It's called a 1013, an involuntary committal. And we had a crime, but that means nothing it's not going to solve the problem. And the person was taken and put into the facility under a doctor's care, and then in 72 hours was released. And now I'm back to answering the questions to a community partner about why was this person back out when clearly they need help and treatment. And I said, well, because the doctor let them out. Well, why can't they keep them? Well, because their rules are they have to let them out if they're stable and they're not a danger to themselves or others. Well, this person did this. I understand that, but it's not illegal. It is illegal. I said, but it's not dangerous to himself or others. It's unsightly and it's illegal, and it's based out of a mental health condition. So we get into this circle of, well, why can't you as an officer take this person somewhere and address this? Because I can't. I have to meet a certain threshold and certain parameters to take someone against their will and put them into a crisis center or a hospital. And then the doctors from there can keep them for a certain period of time, and then they release them. So pie in the sky, if I were king, some sort of mechanism to be able to have judges order assistance, treatment, resources, however you want to word that, without there being arrest would be a huge solution. But that is a rewiring of how our criminal justice system is set up. How do we get to that point? Because I can tell you as an officer doing my job for this long, and the officers that are behind me, it's so frustrating. Nobody knows more than us how frustrating it is to be standing there with someone that you don't even know if they understand what it is that you're trying to tell them, because they're talking to inanimate objects or they're taking their clothes off. Taking them to the jail is not going to be helpful. So we try medical. We try those things. And then sometimes jail is the place that we end up because it's the only place that we have. And to be able to have something else in place in those moments would be huge. It would be so helpful to not arresting people when that's not what it is that they need.
And Ed, what Captain Ross is talking about, and we're very limited in our conversation and where we can really go to create change. She's talking about system issues, right? This is how the system was designed to operate. It's doing what it's supposed to do, which then allows Black and brown bodies to be incarcerated at the rates they're incarcerated in this country. And so we as a community, we can make some micro changes, but we're up against the system. But we have to all be on the same page about what the system is doing what it's designed to do, and then each actively choose white woman, Black woman, male, whatever ethnicity you are, to do whatever we can to take risks to dismantle the system. But again, it starts with these small changes. As I talk about small changes, I'm gonna give another one as you talk about shared power or relinquishing power. I'm going back a couple months to the school supply drive that we had. in the parking lot of Decatur High School, which I was at representing the Student Center. And City of Decatur Police was there. Very small way to share power and to impact change in your community. Instead of that police officer standing there next door to our table, a few tables down, very stoically in his position that was very authoritative, which looks like he's definitely there to police, as children were coming up to get supplies, it could have looked like him getting down on their level, serving, giving supplies to the children to present a different image as a part of, again, protect and serve. Small change, but it builds to that relationship that we talked about earlier that's missing and that's necessary.
Yeah, what you're pointing to, I think both you, Fonta, and Jennifer, is the value of acknowledging the reality that we are playing with. And I think that far too often, because the reality is something that's stark, that is historic in its build, that is difficult to dismantle, that we'd like to ignore that it is those things. But in order for us to make those small ripple of changes that galvanizes large movements, it demands some level of honesty about the systems and structures that we're working with. And I firmly believe that's part of the initial phase of thinking about how do our institutions function and how did we get to the place that they operate in this particular way. I have a question that's related to the taking risk piece. And I'm curious, is there advice that we have or thoughts of how do we prevent the zeal of taking a risk from becoming taking over? That for many people, they want to be participants, they want to be active, they want to be engaged, but that ultimately at times translates into controlling the narrative, being the ones who are showing up in front of cameras, being the ones who are deciding what the needs are for communities that they are not a part of, but they believe they are working in favor of, but they are getting the shine, they are getting the opportunities to speak because of the way in which we think about maleness, we think about whiteness, we think about cisgenderedness in our country, our world. How do we prevent taking a risk from becoming taking over?
It has to be a personal work that's done on behalf of each of us, right? We have to take that on as we work to change the system. I have to really brag on my co-chair of Decolonize Decatur, Paul McLennan, because he gets it. He gets it because he understands, because he's done the personal work, so therefore he understands the way the system works. And so one of the reasons he understands it, part of the personal work, is who he sought out as a mentor in his organizing and activism, which was a Black man who's been mentoring him for about 50 years or more. So the reason why, for example, we've done some press recently in the last 2 days, have done press after the protest that we had on Indigenous Peoples Day against the genocide canon, he didn't take over and doing any of the press with media. Even though I invited him in, he said, no, Fonta, you do it, because he understands the way the system works. And he understands that even though both of him and I may be talking to a reporter, what can very easily happen with him being a cisgender white male is they cut me out of the clip and focus on everything he has to say. So he put me out front, but he did that with intention because he understands the system. The other way we can help prevent that from happening is what I spoke to earlier, having people of color in positions of leadership. It's a safeguard. It doesn't mean that that still can't happen, but you just can't have them in token positions. They need to be in positions of leadership that can affect policy, where their voices will amplify what's happening with others who don't have that leadership position.
I agree with you, Fonta, and I think those are great points. And as being in a position of power and being in a position of authority, I always approach solving problems or making changes as I'm going to do this with the people instead of for the people. And having that deliberate thought of this isn't it's not, I'm not in the trenches. I'm not doing that work. So I need to involve the teachers in solving a problem. I need to involve the students. If there's a problem, let's look at the data, let's talk about it. And always framing my mind of I may not have the answer, but I know that there's people that do have the answer, and tapping them for that work. And then it's that, like I said, the doing with and not doing for people.
I think along those lines, I would say privilege is not something that's just there to be acknowledged. It's something that you experience, and it's something that you always have to be cognizant of. Like Miss Fonta, I have deep admiration for Paul McLennan as well. I think he knows exactly, and we have these conversations all the time as the Decolonized Decatur Committee about like, when is it your time to step back? When is it your time to support someone else, to platform someone else? And it's just, whenever you have a chance to speak, think about who also deserves that. Think about who might not usually be asked to speak. And if there's someone who like comes to mind, then let them speak. It's always about passing the mic. You can do your work without that public recognition and still be completely fulfilled.
We have lots of issues in our community where there are different factions who show up and they think about what these issues in various ways, whether we're talking about schools, whether we're talking about the criminal justice system, whether we're talking about tax allocation, that there are different factions of people and that they see the situation differently, and they have very different set of outcomes. Affordable housing is one that comes to mind in thinking about that. How do we negotiate and manage issues of trust when we know that there are different factions, both have very different sets of goals and objectives, and yet we need to negotiate that in order to come to a set of outcomes that's productive, necessary, and moves the community forward? How do we manage those trust issues when in a heterogeneous environment like that feels like most of our issues are these days?
I think from the silence, that's kind of an indication of it's it's something that as everybody who's doing community work, it's something that we hit as a road bump all the time, and you deal with it by engaging in that difference in opinion. You don't ignore it, certainly. You know, there are plenty of ideological differences that like just everybody within the school system has that, you know, we have to, you know, factor in, or for housing as well, you're saying. I think in a situation which I saw was kind of like a similar question brought up in the Q&A, in a situation where a community feels hurt or a community feels impacted negatively by that, I always think it's really important to make sure that you're not speaking for that community, that you're letting them speak for themselves, and that you're listening to them. Because even if you think you're going in with good intentions, if you have a different view of an outcome and you don't think you're acting in a harmful way, if people say they've been harmed, if people say that this is a reflection of historical oppression, of institutional oppression, then clearly your actions are just reflecting something. So it's, you know, it's an indication to look back at what you did or what you're doing, what you stand for, and always be willing to change that.
And I think that kind of just goes back to understanding your bias, whether you be even like in the minority group, you know, some people are of different, you know, economic status, which kind of sets them apart, even though they are still very much part of that minority group. So I think a good way to kind of have a more general idea, and like it's like to be open to hearing kind of what Koan was saying about other people who have maybe opposing views from you, and to have, you know, that open discussion, and to always be open to changing, you know, your opinion, because I think that is like super important to not just be like set in stone, like, no, this is what I believe, but you know, get different perspectives to like shape, you know, what you're looking at.
The debate coach in me loves that. And I think that it's Captain Ross who spoke like one of the things that we're paying for are the sins of those who came before us, that we also have the traumas that were born on the bodies of people that are bubbling up inside of their ancestry, their folks who are coming after them, and that all of those are things that the first step has to be acknowledging it. And I think that Koan is correct that when in saying that, well, let's not be silent, that it's difficult at times to speak to these things and to acknowledge them. But I think that the place that we run into the biggest challenge is that when we're not willing to acknowledge them, we're not willing to acknowledge the difficulties and the challenges, that we have limited options that are all really terrible. But let's acknowledge that these are limited options and they're all terrible, but can we figure out how to work through them together and be open to change and hear each other, as Kayla suggested?
Something that popped into my head, and it was actually when Kayla was speaking earlier about the defensiveness. And I remember, you know, an example that I would use was Chief Booker was chief when, and I don't know all of the details, but a case came to light where someone had been exonerated from a previous case and sentencing through DNA evidence. So basically this person had served prison time for a crime that he did not commit, and this exoneration takes place, and Chief Booker is now the chief. Well, none of that occurred when any of us were working there. And I think that is a big disconnect sometimes, is when you take it on very personally and you're like, I would have never supported this and I would have never had anything to do this. And you go into this space of me and pushing and put this distance. This is something that happened. So I was in elementary school when this happened. Well, you're here now. And that's a hard, you know, pill to swallow when you're here now and you're the representation of, you signed up to work at this agency, and there's this history there. And it's, I think sometimes people take it wrong. They think of it as I'm taking the blame, or I'm wearing the blame for something that I didn't have any stake in. I would never, ever done that. And that's not where you need to be in that moment. And I remember Chief Booker telling me he met with this gentleman face to face and apologized on behalf of the police department and the city that he didn't even work for at the time that this occurred. Why not? Why wouldn't you? And having somebody and explain it, and it leads me back to one of my favorite sayings, is this isn't about you. Everything in that moment is not about you. This is about what this man went through. And now you're standing here as the representative in the face of the department. So this isn't about you saying that you taking on this, that you did it, but you are a representative of it. Why not do that? Why not have those conversations? And I think the defensiveness that Kayla mentioned earlier, that's a piece to it, is people immediately go into feeling vulnerable and being very defensive. That's their that's their resting point. That's their idle. They idle in wanting to defend themselves. And that's where you have to step back and ask yourself, why? What is it that you're defending?
And Ed, when we're doing that personal work I talked about, and then we are not positioning ourselves to be necessarily defensive or as defensive, right? If we're doing that work, we're understanding that that's a factor that impedes change or relationship building. We're understanding white fragility. There's a friend and comrade for Beacon Hill in the work. Her name is Natsu Sato, and she's in the law department of Georgia State University. In her text, she talks about, and I'm not going to give an exact quote, but she talks about how history is not our fault, but it is our responsibility. And if we're in positions of authority, as we've been talking about, then it is our responsibility to step up in the way that he did. And I have a lot of respect for that.
Yeah, that when thinking about impediments to trust, particularly cross-cultural trust, interracial trust, that it feels like that defensiveness is one of the major obstacles. Because if you are someone who shows up and that your historic narrative is one where the institution that is supposed to support me has failed my grandmother, has failed my mother, is now failing me. I show up, it's not very helpful, but when I communicate my concerns with someone who is working for that agency and their response is to defend the agency because they think they're defending themselves, that makes it really difficult for us to figure out how do we move forward together here. So Captain Ross, I think you are spot on, and Fonta, you're spot on of this is a place where we got to figure out how at the point of contact, the point of engagement, that's the place where many a times it will determine whether or not we're going to move forward together, we're going to listen to each other, and we're going to figure out how to address this immediate issue. And it gets destroyed because of that.
I mean, I think that ties right into like what's happening at the state level right now at the school board. Like that's defensiveness at its strongest. It's trying to avoid the responsibility that history gives us all. I think I really like how Decatur has kind of responded and said that we're not going to stick to the ideals that the state is putting forward right now. But I think what's happening in a larger community right now at a national stage is people are trying to avoid responsibility. People are only being defensive, and they don't want to put in the effort, and they don't want to recognize their privilege. They don't want to act on their privilege either. Yeah.
And because of that, what Koan's speaking to, it impedes the practice of empathy as well. Because you can't allow yourself to step in the place or the shoes or imagine what someone else's lived experience is if you're busy, and I think we spoke to this, right, defending your position when it has nothing to do with you. You're over-identifying with the racist structures in your community. It is not about you, as we said.
Kayla and Koan, this question is for you, and I want to start with you, but I think it can sort of branch out to some other people as well, because I imagine that there'll be some thoughts beyond that. But I definitely want to start here with you. That it was important for us for this conversation that we had some folks who represented a significant body of our community, folks who are younger, who are important, have thoughts, are engaged, see the world in a way that's different from those of us who are older than 30. And it's just that, while significant and part of us, it's just a different way of framing and thinking about the world. And I'm curious, are there some issues that you think would be significantly improved if there was a more open and honest conversation with teenagers in Decatur, if you were brought to the table as honest brokers about how do we move forward in line with that notion of power sharing? You get to make some of the decisions and inform the direction that we go in, instead of the in loco parentis that happens far too often, where I am older, I get to make all of the decisions on your behalf. Are there some things that would just get improved if we just had more conversations with folks like you, and you got to make some of the decisions.
Yeah, I think even the fact of like making the decisions is really like important, because I feel like as of now, like specifically Decatur, they're open to hearing feedback and like student feedback, like, oh well, I would change this. Like, well, students are saying that they're having a hard time with this. And basically with people of power or in positions of power, they're basically saying, okay, thank you for this feedback, you know, I'll think about it, or like, you know, I'll consider it. So it still kind of plays into the whole power dynamic, because ultimately they are, you know, making the decisions. And a lot of the time, can you hear my thing is breaking up?
Yes,
Okay.
we still hear you.
So a lot of the time, you know, once they give their feedback and their thoughts, they don't see where, like, you know, it goes basically in action, or even if, you know, it was actually implemented in the decision.
I completely agree with Kayla. To answer your question, like my gut reaction is just to say everywhere. Like there's no specific one field that it would work better than another. And teenagers are really good at being brutally honest, actually. So, you know, it's not difficult to like get the consensus or the opinion of teenagers. It's something that is pretty easy to do. Yeah, once again, it's hard to find a specific field. I think we like especially students in Decatur are really good at being involved in like a lot of different things. It's not just, we don't just stay inside our school, and the schools encourage us to go into our community. And so I think even in issues of affordable housing, just talking about what it's like for students who've lived in that's a really important demographic to talk to. And then to Kayla's point, I think as well, there's a really important line to draw between involving in the discussion and being part of the decision making. And that it's that second part that students are barely ever considered in. It's that second part where we just have to sit back and wait and see if what we said happens, if it influenced anything. Yeah.
I've really enjoyed hearing from Kayla and Koan. I think it's, to me, lifting that student voice is so essential. Next week, I'll be meeting with our superintendent student advisory team to hear from students and get their input on what's happening. How does the school system look? I think one of the things that I would love for this student group to work on is writing a student bill of rights. So what are the rights that all of our students should have in our school system? How do we preserve those rights that our students should have in a classroom? I had a meeting last year with a group of students from the high school and some of the high school administrators, and I'd made a suggestion that why don't we have our students write a code of conduct for teachers? So here's what we need our teachers to do. And it was not popularly received by the high school administration. They're like, why would we let the kids tell us what to do? I said, well, we turn and tell the kids what to do all the time. Why don't we take that both ways? And that goes back to me to helping disperse the power. And if the power is held within one person all the time, the inequities are going to persist inevitably. So I really want to elevate the student voice and bring them to the table to help make decisions.
So we have about 15 minutes left. I have one final question for you, and it'll bookend the quote that I shared from Inclusion Nudge. And we've been talking about decision making and inclusion and power sharing as mechanisms for better decision making and building a sense of trust. And I'm curious, what do you think we can do to shift our inclusive decision making from a notion of nice to have to something that's the default and the norm? What are some things, and thinking about the way in which all of our institutions operate in the city of Decatur. All of our organizations operate in the city of Decatur, that we move from a decision-making model where we think about inclusion that, oh, that's nice to have, to it is the default and the norm.
I mean, I can give some very specific like examples. I think especially with city elections coming up, this is really pertinent, but finding representatives who don't have to remember that equity is an important thing, who know that, who live and breathe equity. I think it means for our school system involving the Department of Equity more, expanding the Department of Equity to be more than like a one-person position to a fully functioning institution that always centers issues of inclusion and diversity in any action the school does. In the same way, the city's local government having an office for equity there is a really important, just having positions where you can centralize and focus issues of diversity and inclusion and acceptance that way, so that it's not an afterthought, that it's always involved in the process.
Ed, I'm going to just illustrate this with an example of where it wasn't in a default mode and should be and is more so now. A couple years back, when we took information that I had pushed out to the community and in meetings in response to a constant question that I would receive about what is suspicious and when do I call the police? And the decision was made that putting that on social media or discussing it in meetings wasn't enough. We needed to have something that we could distribute, printed, digital, trying to hit as many people as we possibly could to educate people on the whole piece to calling about suspicious people. When we started to design what this was going to look like, we took the mock-up to the Better Together Advisory Board and asked them to give their feedback. And we got different feedback from every single person that looked at this mock-up. And the thing that hit me in the feedback we got was it had to do with the race of basically the actor and a volunteer on the cover of the original brochure, that people found it bothersome that he was an African-American male that was speaking to the police. And what we were depicting was that he was making the call and reporting whatever it was to the police. And in that moment, it taught me a lot about, I viewed that as that's a homeowner calling to try to kind of change the narrative. And because this was somebody that we knew and we wanted to utilize for this project, that grew up in Decatur and graduated from Decatur High School, and being open, truly open to when you hand something off to someone and ask for their feedback, being open means not being defensive about, but this is why I did this. It turned into being a truly collaborative piece and being able to make multiple versions of a brochure that I think had a far better impact than the original one. So and that's just a minuscule example of what I think is when you say that you're going to be open about collaboration and take that feedback, it has to remain that way. You have to start in that place so that is a default. It's not just, we're going to do it for this project.
I think it's incredibly important, Ed, that we understand the intersectionality of the issues of inequity that we're talking about. I think too often times it gets focused solely on race or ethnicity, and we ignore or don't pay enough attention to the classism issue that exists in City of Decatur. So the issue around economics and how that intersects with race and ethnicity is incredibly important, Because as we talk about the inequity that exists at these intersectionalities, we're missing a lot of voices. And when we can also elevate those who are already taking action to address inequities and hear what they have to say, then we can capture those who are already being missed. A very specific example of that is the leadership demonstrated by Commissioner Lisa Mayer in making sure that the survey about the police chief that we're hiring got out to everyone. And it was just a handful of us. It was myself, an ally in the community, and Lisa that went knocking on doors in the apartment complexes in City of Decatur. And there wasn't not one door we knocked on that those individuals were aware, despite best efforts, that we were actively working to hire a police chief. One of the issues as we talk about inequity was around the readability of the survey. There were some community members, as I was engaging with the survey, who didn't very clearly understand the language. Some I couldn't talk to because their language wasn't a part of what the survey was going to allow them to understand and respond to. So understanding the multifaceted issues around equity and what that looks like to engage all community members is incredibly important.
And I think even the process of not just like handing the different organizations like the feedback, but like giving them a seat at the actual table is like very important, because like it kind of comes back to the whole thing of like, you know, okay, I'll consider this. But when everyone is at the table, you know, giving their different ideas and brainstorming together, there's no really reason to have different, well, of course, there's going to be different drafts, but like multiple, because everyone is like in that process together from the jump.
So that was the final question that I had. And I think it feels like this is a good place for us to conclude, but I do have some sort of parting words that I'm interested in sharing a bit and thinking about this conversation that we just had. That, as I alluded to earlier and sort of spoke to, that one of the things that I am very much vested in is how do we create spaces and opportunities where people who show up with different experiences, different sets of capabilities, that we can pull those together and move in the direction of justice, move in the direction of creating a more equitable community where we acknowledge that there are differences and disparities, but those are not grounded in biology. They are grounded in a sense of the way in which we have created understandings of culture and the way in which we've allocated resources, and that we can change culture and that we can reallocate resources in a way that creates a community that's more welcoming, that's more hospitable, and that honors the beauty in the myriad of ways in which it shows up. And what I'm so thankful for about each of you and your willingness to share your brilliance with me is that I'm taking away some ideas, and I think that all of us will, that will live on in prosperity on the website of here are things that we could do that builds trust in our community and makes that elusive world more likely. Let's take more risk, that if we are in a position where we are bestowed a sense of power and authority, let's take some risk in using that on behalf of making the world a little bit better for those who have not been allocated as much. Let's actively share power by listening to others, creating decision-making models where there are people who are at the table who historically have not been identified as people who are capable of making good decisions or should make the decisions, but we all know that when we're talking about the lives of particular people, they have the best interest at hand and that they know far more than we do. So let's share the power and listen to them. Can we empathize with others? Can we not just perspective take, but perspective seek? That let's not just think about how do others see the world, but let's actually solicit their contributions and thoughts. Let's not think about what it was like when I was 15 years old and make policies for teenagers. Instead, let's talk to them because they have an idea of what it means to live in this particular moment that's very different from what it was like when I lived at that moment. Let's perspective seek and not just perspective take. And let's stop being defensive. It's not about you. It's about the institutions. It's about the structures that we work for. And it is about coming together to transform those structures and institutions in something that is worthy of Decatur, something that's worthy of all of the people in the city of Decatur, particularly those who have lacked the support, who have lacked opportunities, who have lacked a sense of justice, and can we leverage those to create openings so that they can be part of the process? Thank you very much for sharing your brilliance and sharing your wisdom. And I'm so appreciative and thankful that I am a member of the same community that you all are.
Thank you, Ed. Really appreciate being